just when you thought the Memphis Grizzlies were finally going to be healthy and get their feet under them and see just how good they could be in terms of their starting lineup, their rotation, putting all the pieces together. Unfortunately, another injury has befallen the Memphis Grizzlies, and we once again are going to be asking here on Locked On Grizzlies, how do they respond? How do they replicate? How do they replace? Two guys you're not going to have to replace are myself and Damichael. We're back together, and we're talking Grizzlies basketball here on Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Grizzlies, a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts. Rate, review, subscribe on Stitcher, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get podcasts, you can find us there. You can also find us on YouTube. Like and comment, subscribe, make us a part of your NBA and Grizzlies fan experience anywhere that you can get YouTube videos or podcasts. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel, our wonderful new partnership with FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On today to get started. I am joined on this episode by my wonderful co-host, Damichael Cole. Again, globe-trotting Damichael Cole, hanging out over on the best coast, the West Coast, following the Grizzlies as they continue their road trip of doom is currently how it kind of feels. I know I listened to the show on Monday or Tuesday, Damichael, and you kind of talked about the vibe and the body language and how things, are progressing there for the Grizzlies. I know you didn't really get to interact with them much today, but just your overall kind of takeaway after, the back-to-back losses there. Now Memphis on a 3-game losing streak. How is the vibe just, after a day to kind of process, the Grizzlies, again, for the first time since 2021, losing 3 games in a row?
Yeah. A couple things that the guy said. Tyus Jones, I think, is probably one of the most level-headed, he's a natural leader type guy. And, he said the thing is we have to stay true to who we are. Stay true, continue to do the things that we've always done. Dillon Brooks took a more of a stronger stance, saying, how do we respond? That's the next thing. We have to respond. How do we respond? We need a sense of urgency, I believe, were his exact words there. So they're not overreacting, but they know.
Right.
They are aware of what's going on. And I mean, just to tell you, on the heels of the news about Steven Adams, it doesn't get much easier going forward these next couple games.
Yeah, it's going to be challenging for them. And you put out a tweet on your Twitter account at Damichael C there. The point that you made with the graphic that you shared, this season, Steven Adams is first in total offensive rebounds, first in offensive rebounds per game, first in offensive rebound percentage. He's posting the first 5+ offensive rebound per game season since Andre Drummond in 2018-2019, and the highest offensive rebound percentage since Dennis Rodman almost 20 years ago now, 1995-1996. And that's all courtesy. I'm not sure what FW stands for. You could probably fill that
Fadeaway World, I believe.
There you go, Fadeaway World. Thank you, buddy. So credit to them for that graphic. I think that one of the fascinating things that I wrote about this over at my Substack, Written in the Dark. You said it well. You can't replace that, right? There's no way to replace what Steven Adams brings to this team, diagnosed with a sprained PCL, in case you missed it, out for 3 to 5 weeks. Likely he's back around the All-Star break. Steven Adams, outside of Ja Morant being the cyborg mutant that he likes to call himself. If I ever was to pick somebody on the Grizzlies to be closer to the 3 than the 5, I would lean towards Steven Adams. But again, he comes back in 3 weeks and it's the All-Star break. So it almost makes sense to kind of say he's out until after the All-Star break, to me, in my head at least. But, I digress. That's a scary place, my head. Damichael, I'm curious, when you look at this team trying to get back on its feet, going into a game against the Warriors, which we'll talk more about here later in the show, they're going to have to do it without arguably their player that contributes to winning without having to score the most of anybody on the team. I mean, his plus minus in terms of his overall efficiency differential, according to Cleaning the Glass, he's the best on the team now in terms of that number behind Jaren Jackson Jr. He's second best, and Jaren hasn't played 1,000 minutes yet this season. So among Grizzlies players that has played at least 1,000 minutes, it's Steven Adams that has impacted winning the most over a longer period of time, and he's gone for the next 10 or so games.
Yeah, Joe, we talked about it a lot on why these starters are so important in their own rights. Like when Ja goes down, you're losing. The Grizzlies are the top paint scoring team in the NBA, and that's mainly because of Ja Morant. The Grizzlies do not shoot, as well, from the three-point range as they do scoring inside. They're a middle-of-the-pack three-point shooting team. So thank goodness they have Desmond Bane, right? Then on the wing, we mentioned Dillon Brooks and his defensive impact. Jaren Jackson Jr. is the sole reason why this team has jumped to the top 10 in steals and blocks. And Steven Adams is the sole reason why this team is the top rebounding team in the NBA by about 2 rebounds. You mentioned his offensive rebounding numbers, which is where Steven Adams completely separates himself from most of the guys as a all-around rebounder on the offensive side of things. And the Grizzlies miss a lot of shots from time to time. We've seen games where the Grizzlies will shoot 41, 42%, and the opponent will shoot 45, 46%, and the Grizzlies win by 10 points. And that is because Steven Adams is generating, these extra possessions, And then when they get these extra possessions, Joe, the thing about it is the defense isn't set. It's easy to get a kick out three-pointer wide open. It's easy to catch a guy cutting to the basket. He's so important. And, like I said, each one of those guys are a reason why the Grizzlies are top of the NBA at something. And Steven Adams is the reason this is the top rebounding team in the NBA right now. And here's the other thing, Joe, and it'll be interesting to see what you think on this one. How do they, is it as simple? And I'm going to ask Taylor Jenkins this as well, but is it as simple as, hey, Xavier Tillman, plug him in at center, and the rotation stays the same? Or do you mix and mingle some things now? Do we see more Jaren Jackson Jr. at the 5, possibly, Santi Aldama starting into the starting lineup at the 4? What type of point production would that generate? But then, a guy like Brandon Clark, do you bring him in? This is your big money guy, right? You're paying him all this money. You're paying him Robert Williams type money. You're paying him Wendell Carter type money. Is this for these type moments right here? So a lot of options on the table. I think the simple formula is just inserting Xavier Tillman, and everything else around the Grizzlies stays the same. But how beneficial can that be to the overall product is the question. Steven Adams is a big loss.
And I think you can argue when you're in the midst of a 3-game losing streak, the first one in over a calendar year, does it make sense to stick with the status quo? Or is this in a way its own possible a gift? It's an excuse to try something different, to mix things up and give different looks and, change the energy a little bit. Steven Adams rebounding is going to be extremely important. I think the player that's going to miss him most is Ja Morant, not just in terms of, having a bodyguard on the floor, which is what Adams has been a time or two for Ja, but screen assists. People like to make fun of the stat screen assist with Rudy Gobert and, all the arguments for how important Gobert was in Utah. But guess who's number 1 in the league in screen assists this season, at least going into this recording? Wow. It was Steven Adams, 0.1 in front of Domantas Sabonis, and I got that number from NBA.com/stats. He's number 1 in screen assists. So he creates space for Morant to work with. He creates the opportunity to have Morant's athleticism on display, his handle, his ability to slow down in the paint, feel a defender on his back, know where he's at while he's examining the floor and feeling the guy behind him. All that is not necessarily gone and washed. I think one of the things that makes Xavier Tillman an option for replacing Steven Adams, and we'll talk more about other ways to do it in our next segment here in a moment. But I think that the easiest thing to do would be to replace Adams with Tillman and just keep rocking on. I see this as an opportunity to try some different things and to prioritize shaking things up a bit for a team that maybe has gotten not necessarily stale, but a little bit different energy could be coming. And I think this is a great opportunity for that. So we'll talk more about that here in a moment. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. Again, our wonderful new partner here at Locked On. The NFL playoffs are here, and we're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the number one sportsbook in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. New customers can join today to get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. You just sign up at FanDuel.com/locked-on. FanDuel has all your favorite bets from the money line to point spreads, player props. Obviously, the NFL playoffs, conference championship Sunday is coming up, but NBA, NHL, literally every sport you can think of, FanDuel's got it all. Maybe you like the idea of the 49ers and the Chiefs getting back after it, the Joe Montana Bowl, or maybe you want to see the Eagles and the Bengals mix it up in the Super Bowl. Lots of different ways you can go in terms of your bets. Lots of different things you can do on a safe and fun app that is super easy to use with FanDuel. Football fans, fans of sports, don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at FanDuel.com/locked-on. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. We will be talking about ways to replace the irreplaceable Steven Adams next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am one of your hosts, Joe Mullinax, joined by Commercial Appeal, Damichael Cole, wonderful beat writer for the Memphis Grizzlies. If you haven't been checking out his work over at the Commercial Appeal, you're really missing out. He's out on the road with Memphis at Damichael C on Twitter. I don't just say that because he's my partner. I enjoyed Damichael's work before we were partners here on Locked On Grizzlies. I believe I was your first podcast when you got the job back when I was at
believed
GBB.
in me before everyone.
I absolutely did. So, and that's not fair. Everybody, others did too. Obviously, the Commercial Appeal did. They hired you. But I was really excited about Damichael coming back to Memphis. You're from there, and I've always enjoyed Damichael's work even before we were together. So check the receipts on that. I'm not just sucking up to my co-host. Damichael, I think that we left the previous segment talking about how do you respond to this? Do you start Xavier Tillman? I would not. Not start Xavier Tillman. I would start Brandon Clark. Going back to my time at GBB, the current site manager at GBB, Parker Fleming, was my associate editor when I was there running the show. And Parker is a big positionless basketball guy.
Yep.
He is a fan of Jaren Jackson, the center. And I, too, have bought into this idea. And I think that you go Jaren Jackson Jr. and Brandon Clark. Those are the two guys that I would start. You mentioned in the previous part of the show the idea of, you pay Brandon Clark, Wendell Carter Jr. money. You pay him Robert Williams money. I would give him a chance to show, not necessarily that he's worth it, because I think he's worth it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Tyus Jones, like we've talked about with Tyus in the past. These are the guys you've invested in. You've chosen to put the money into them to stick around and be a part of this core long term. Here's a chance to go in as a starter. The defensive malleability, versatility, the capacity to switch, defend shots in a different way, give different coverages. And we talk about losing possessions, right? Yeah. With Steven Adams no longer being there for offensive rebounds. A way to gain those possessions back. Obviously, Clark and Jackson Jr. aren't tremendous rebounders, but you know what they are good at? Attacking passing lanes, getting those stocks, those steals, those blocks. You can replicate what Adams was in terms of those extra possessions in the aggregate through Clark and Jackson Jr. Is Xavier Tillman underrated when it comes to those numbers? I think so. He's not terrible in that department, but Clark and Jackson as a pairing defensively just have such tremendous potential. That is where I would like to see Coach Jenkins go, starting with Golden State tonight.
I think you start Xavier Tillman, Joe, but I do see I'm picking up what you're putting down here. This is not just a complete rebuttal. This is more of you start Xavier Tillman Sr., but he's not playing Steven Adams minutes. You start him, you use Brandon Clark in a similar role. You got to think about it in terms of the pairings. I think that pairing that they like with Jaren Jackson Jr., Brandon Clark, Desmond Bane running with Tyus Jones, and it's been John Conchar lately, but I'm sure, it's going to get mixed up a little bit. John Conchar, 5 points in his last 6 games, but that's neither here nor there.
Well, and Conchar is also out, right? He's in concussion protocol.
He's in concussion protocol right now, right? So there is that as well. So that's going to, mix up, but that group can fill it up. That's the group that usually gets them back into a lot of games, and usually if they have a 5-point lead, goes to 10 to 15. And I know, Taylor Jenkins is a pairings guy. He doesn't want to completely mess that up. That's why in the Timberwolves series, when Brandon Clark was arguably the best Grizzlies player, he and Desmond Bane were probably tit for tat. During that series, production-wise, they still kept bringing Brandon Clark off of the bench. So I think you start Xavier Tillman, because the word I use when I think of Xavier Tillman is force. He's going to play with force. He's going to move some guys out of the way. Probably not like Steven Adams, but he's going to play hard. He's going to demand his position. You're not just going to bully ball him and move him out of the way. And he knows how to play the game of basketball. So all that said, I think one thing that he's figured out on the offensive end is he has that little floater push shot too, like a Tyus, like a Brandon Clark, like a Ja, and it's money. I've been noticing him shoot it more and more, and he has it. That should be his shot. So now that he's found his comfort with that, I think you start Xavier Tillman. And here's another thing that we haven't talked about. A lot of people are going to say the Jaren Jackson Jr. to the 5 thing, right? Jaren Jackson Jr., we've talked about it. Foul trouble, he has kind of avoided it more this season. A big part of that is Dylan Brooks, I've mentioned. And we've also briefly talked about this in the Steven Adams standpoint. Steven Adams is also a rim protector for the Grizzlies. And the way Steven Adams protects the rim is he allows Jaren Jackson Jr. in a way to kind of freelance across the floor. When you have Steven Adams on the back line, teams still aren't going to try to dunk over him. And Jaren Jackson's able to come from the weak side and block shot. He's able to close out on 3-point guys and block shots. And usually your best shot blocker, Nick Claxton can't do that for the Nets. If he's closing out on 3-pointers, it's an offensive rebound because the rest of the Nets are small. With the Grizzlies, you got Steven Adams down there. So that's the underrated part to this is if you put Jaren Jackson Jr. at the 5, the Grizzlies got to change how they use him defensively. Some things switch up, Joe.
That's true. I would argue that it's time for a switch up. You've lost 3 games in a row. You look not so good on the road. And while I think the larger sample size of the entire season, they're obviously still having success. Even in the last, 14 games, they've lost their last 3, but they're 11-3 in their last 14. So they're still a pretty good basketball team. My thing is it's an opportunity to kind of open up Pandora's box a little bit, see what you got. You know what you have in Xavier Tillman. You and I have talked about that, Damichael. This guy, the floater has developed some, but again, Brandon Clark can get to that spot by himself. He's shown self-creation ability. He can do that on his own off the dribble. Xavier Tillman is still very dependent on others. He's essentially the big John Conchar in terms of carefully cultivated floaters for Xavier Tillman. He's not capable of doing some of those same things. I think the best argument for starting Tillman, and you touched on it a little bit, and I mentioned I'm writing about this in my Substack. The third best player net rating beyond Jaren and Bane for Ja Morant is Xavier Tillman. Because Xavier Tillman, and it's a much smaller sample size. They've only played together like 50 minutes so far this season. But part of the reason for that is Tillman does a lot of the same things that Steven Adams does. He is physical. You say he plays with force, and that's fair. Ja Morant needs that guy to create that space so that with his handle and his athleticism, he can close it. So to me, that's the best argument for staying with Tillman is it's less change on Ja. And if you don't have Ja Morant scoring 25 to 30 a night, this is all a moot point anyway.
And that's what it's going to come down to. I think we talk about all the little things that Steven Adams does, and you're going to see why those things are important over this stretch. But you're also going to see that, Xavier Tillman, we talked about it. He's limited, right? There's no way around it. This isn't a guy, I was, one of those people who voiced that during the summer league. I expected him to dominate. Like your third-year guy, you go down there, you average 20 and 12 against these little small itty-bitty kids. Like he was supposed to, it was supposed to be his playground, but it wasn't. He looked like regular season Xavier Tillman Sr. So he is limited, but you mentioned it. When you put him on the floor with Jaren, Ja, Dez, and all those guys, you're playing a limited role. So you don't have to do anything out. They're not going to ask you to do a spin move, fadeaway, turnaround shot, or they're not going to ask you to dribble 10 times and Euro step to the lane and things like that. Overall, if you just talk about how he can help, he's not afraid to take the three-pointer. So I'm sure there are going to be times, again, when you got Ja Morant on the floor, now you got 4 guys around him who are going to take three-point shots. And, when given the opportunities, I think he helps the spacing from that standpoint. We've seen against certain teams, he can rebound really well, and he's mobile, right? If you want to talk about the difference between he and Steven Adams is better when you're talking about going against Nikola Jokic, Vucevic, those big men, Valanciunas, has had his worst games of the season against Steven Adams. But Xavier Tillman's better against your Karl Anthony Towns, of the world, as we saw in the postseason, last season. He's better against those type centers. So we'll see how this 5-week period work out over the long haul. But, Joe, so many questions that have to be answered, and we'll see how the Grizzlies kind of, go about it with their lineups, with their pairings, and everything in between.
That's why they play the games, right? That's why they play the games, and that's why Taylor Jenkins gets paid the big bucks. He's got to make those tough decisions. We can talk with our handsome headphones on all day about what we would do. It's on Coach Jenkins and his staff to do what's best for the Grizzlies in their minds. So I think that you're probably right that they'll stay with Xavier Tillman. We have a pretty large sample size of this staff at this point, that they're going to try to stay with those pairings, the rotations as best they can. I am just saying that it's a chance to mix things up a little bit. The natives are restless. I know you've noticed that, Damichael, on Twitter. Not to say that they should be. Again, 3 games is not a whole season, but I think that, showing that you're acknowledging that things are a bit stale might calm some nerves a little bit. But I guess we'll have to see how that looks against the Golden State Warriors. And that's a great segue to our last part of the show. When we come back, we'll be talking Grizzlies Warriors and how that plays out. Again, with Steven Adams out and with the Warriors, trying to get back into the playoff picture with Steph Curry healthy, how is that all going to fit going into a big one as the Grizzlies try to end their first losing streak in a long time? We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. We are back, myself and Damichael, reunited, and it feels so good. Damichael is following the Grizzlies up and down the West Coast and eventually Minnesota on this road trip that Memphis is on. I am comfortably hanging out in my home as Damichael works very hard. But we're both watching the Grizzlies just in very different ways. I'm watching from the comfort of my lazy boy. Damichael's there on press row watching this team up close and personal. And that work continues, Damichael, for you against the Golden State Warriors tonight. How do you see this shaking out? We covered that we think Xavier Tillman will probably be the starter. I don't really like that idea, but I think that's what they're going to do. I'm agreeing with you on that front. So looking at, we mentioned John Conchar. He's out because he's in concussion protocol. So that's another piece of the puzzle. Maybe David Roddy gets back into the mix a little bit here. Obviously, those are fringe rotation players. One of the keys here is to get those starters, especially Ja, who was out against the Kings, in fairness, Bane, Jaren, Dylan Brooks, who's had a rough couple of games, getting them back with their feet underneath them and looking as if they are not necessarily engaged, because to me, that's lazy to say. They're not engaged. They're not trying. Right. For whatever reason, they're not communicating. You hear Taylor Jenkins talk about that all the time, communicating on defense. Maybe they're not executing, making the extra pass that they normally would offensively. It feels like in a rivalry kind of situation against the Warriors, 2 teams that don't like each other. This is kind of like how Stella got her groove back. I'm probably dating myself with that reference. How the Grizzlies got their groove back. It's not going to be easy in Chase Center, but if there was ever a place for the groove to come back against Golden State, could be good motivation for Memphis.
Joe, you hit on it. I was joking about this earlier, and I said the funny thing about this game is it doesn't matter how many games the Grizzlies lost. Well, it matters, but the fact that a win over Golden State, I think, would essentially wipe all the pain away of the first 3 games of this road trip, winning a game in Golden State at the Chase Center. But, there's some narrative things here. And, I was at Golden State's practice on today, and I actually got an exclusive one-on-one interview with Klay Thompson. So you can check out that story as well over at commercialappeal.com today ahead of the game. And but one thing, just talking to him, talking to Steve Kerr and, you know, people with the Warriors, there's a mutual respect between these two things. You know, Steve Kerr called it a rivalry, and that is news only because you remember last year he wouldn't say it, Joe. He said, he kind of big time the Grizzlies, right? He said, hey, there has to be some playoff games. There has to be some type of tenseness there, you know, before it's a rivalry. And today, talking to him, I mean, after the practice, talking to him, he basically said, yeah, it's becoming a bit of a rivalry. So I doubled back on it. I said, hey, you know, you just said it's becoming a bit of a rivalry. And he said, hey, the playoff series did it. You know, situations like that have made it become a rivalry. Klay Thompson basically echoed that same message. And they both said something similar, like, you know, the Grizzlies are on our heels. So they know that the Grizzlies are right there. So there's a mutual respect. But just getting back to your point on the game here, the Warriors have kind of played a small ball lineup lately. Kevon Looney has been coming off the bench the last couple of games. I've been seeing Grizzlies Twitter is completely petrified of this man all of a sudden because of, I mean, we saw Christmas Day. If you saw Christmas Day and you saw Game 6 of last season, Kevon Looney is the biggest of your worries. It's not Draymond, Klay, Steph, etc. But they're bringing him off the bench right now. That'll be the most interesting thing I want to see. Does Golden State continue to say, hey, we're trying this small ball lineup right now. Let's see if this still works. Or do they say, you know what? Kevon Looney has had really good games against the Grizzlies in his last 2 games. Let's stick with that. And then, again, I don't know what it is when the Warriors play the Grizzlies. All of a sudden, the last 2 times these 2 teams have played, the Warriors have out-rebounded the Grizzlies, but the Warriors are not in the top 10 in rebounding, and the Grizzlies are the top rebounding team. It's one of the most puzzling things in my mind, Joe. And you know what? It makes me think maybe some wacko thing like Steven Adams being out can shift some. I don't know. I mean, Xavier Tillman, again, he is a more mobile defender. And, you know, if you listen to Draymond Green's podcast, he's talked about, you know, in small dosages how, you know, teams can attack a guy like Steven Adams. So Xavier Tillman kind of, you know, well, and more of Brandon Clark, who's probably going to close games now. Brandon Clark is more of your swing defender who can guard multiple positions and kind of, you know, navigate through those situations. But, Joe, I'm up in the fence on this one. Both these teams need this win in a worse way. I think the Warriors have lost 4 consecutive at home after starting off fiery hot at home, and now the Grizzlies have lost 3 in a row. Something's got to give, Joe.
The unstoppable force meeting the immovable object, as I like to rip off from Gorilla Monsoon of pro wrestling fame. I think for me, Damichael, the thing that I'm most worried about going into this game is I'll be honest, it was late. I did not stay up and watch the Kings game. I watched it the next day after I recorded it. And between watching it and looking at the box score, you know, I see players like Keegan Murray just completely going crazy. I can't say the second word because we're a family-friendly podcast. Just going completely nuts from beyond the arc. Harrison Barnes, 6 of 9 from 3. Murray, 5 of 7. Trey Lyles, 6 of 8. Part of that is hot shooting. Life. Right. Yeah. Part of that is hot shooting and just, you know, being red hot. Sometimes you run into a buzzsaw. I get that, especially in a long NBA season. Part of that is the Grizzlies' 3-point defense. We've talked about it on the show before. It's not great at times. Consistently, it hasn't been great. So to look at the Memphis defense going against Steph Curry, Andrew Wiggins is healthy now. Klay Thompson will be out there. I'm nervous to see Jordan Poole. You know, these are all guys that can fill it up in a variety of ways, especially from the perimeter. And the Grizzlies just had, you know, the biggest shellacking of the season, in part because the Kings just got hot and they're a good offensive team. But you don't give up that many threes in that method without some of them being open because of missed rotations or because of lacking foot speed or lateral quickness. Whatever reason you want to subscribe, it wasn't just the Kings were really good. It was also Memphis missed some stuff. So I'm curious to see how they respond in terms of their scrambling, in terms of their attacking on the perimeter, making a team that is historically good, you know, over the span of Curry and Thompson's career, at making and taking the three. How do they address that problem when they weren't able to against, in theory, a lesser perimeter threat? I know Sacramento's really good this year, but if you're putting the Kings and the Warriors next to each other, you're saying the Warriors are the better offensive squad. They got to respond defensively or else it's going to be another long night.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned the comparison between these two, because Dillon Brooks did just that when I was talking to him in the locker room after the Kings game. He said, it's the perfect opponent. Golden State is the perfect opponent after a game like that because there are the similarities. And the similarities are right in our face. There is one with Kevin Huerter, who was drafted by the Atlanta Hawks in part when the Hawks are trying to duplicate a Steph Curry, Klay Thompson backcourt with Trae Young and Kevin Huerter once upon a time. And so Herter's comp out of Maryland was Klay Thompson. So there is that part of it. And then there's the most obvious one, Mike Brown. He was the assistant coach on the Golden State Warriors. So there are those similarities. Dillon Brooks has pointed them out. And I think based off what you just said, Joe, this will be the perfect game after that type of game to say, hey, let's see if they really toned in on some of the things that they need to improve on, on the defensive side of the basketball, protecting the rim, guarding the perimeter and balancing those things out. And I mentioned protecting the rim because the Grizzlies are great at protecting the rim, but they're giving up, so many three-point shots. There has to be a better, balance there overall. It's 2023. Protecting the rim is great, but teams are shooting 30, 40 three-pointers a game these days. And I think that's a big part of it. But, Joe, there is no opponent who is, better suited to test what the Grizzlies need to improve at right now.
Hopefully they watched a lot of film and they figured some things out. I do think losing Adams against the Warriors in particular could be a gift in terms of defending the three a little bit better, a little less drop coverage, a little more switching on the perimeter. Xavier Tillman is capable of doing that. He's not as good at it as Clark, in my opinion, but he physically can do it. And I think that'll maybe make it a little bit easier for that switch to be made. But a big game there that you'll be in attendance for, Damichael. Grizzlies Warriors tonight. I believe it's on ESPN.
Yeah.
Thanks for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. Now make your second listen game to game NBA. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. Speaking of me being old and washed, going back to talking about the Kings game, this is another one that starts at 10 o'clock on the East Coast. So, spoiler alert, the next episode of Locked On Grizzlies will once again be Damichael Cole talking you through what happened in Grizzlies Warriors. But we'll finish out the week together, Damichael, getting ready for your final game of the road trip against the Wolves. But, it's going to be really interesting to see how they respond against the Warriors like we just talked about. And I know you'll have another chance to be there in the arena, see the players live, getting their, take on whatever the outcome is. It's either snapping a losing streak, good, or it's an 0-4 road trip that could become a clean sweep if they're not careful.
This is a big one.
You're going to get a lot of interesting content for the Locked On Grizzlies episode on Thursday.
This is doom or gloom right here. I was talking with the Warriors people about this because one of these teams is about to stomp the other one while they're down because Golden State, as I mentioned, they're struggling at home right now. So for Memphis, of all teams, to come in and beat you while you're struggling, that's going to hurt. The Grizzlies, you already lost 3 in a row. To lose to the Warriors, 2 on top of that, and be 0-4 on a road trip, that's going to hurt. So one of these teams can erase the pain, right? The Grizzlies have a chance. If you beat Golden State, all the momentum is going to be on Memphis' side as they head to Minnesota. And if you come out of this road trip 2-3, with the way the Western Conference has been, I think people will be okay, with that result overall. So, Joe, it's a chance to make amends, to a slow start to the road trip and kind of, work out some of those kinks and put some more smiles, on the faces of Grizzlies Nation.
Not terrifying smiles like that, actual good smiles. So, yes, I think, Damichael, hopefully you'll have some good news for our wonderful listeners on Thursday on the next episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. It is much appreciated. Again, proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Find us on YouTube, like and comment, anywhere you get podcasts. Rate, review, subscribe. Continue to make Locked On Grizzlies a part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies experience. Until next time, that's the wonderful Damichael Cole. I am Joe Mullinax. Stay locked in. This is Locked On Grizzlies.